Hello, and welcome to our YouTube live presentation, Hands-On with Alien Clay. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to discuss some of the newest additions to the Chavant line of sulfur-free clays, the Alien Clay series. My name's Janessa, and I'm the Sales and Marketing Manager for Chavant. I'll be your host for today's event. I have a lot of fun with these versatile, high-performance sculpting and casting clays. I can't wait to show you what they can do and how they work. If you're already an experienced fine artist or modeler, I'm hoping today's demonstrations will answer any questions you have about the capabilities of these clays, as well as give you another material option for your creative problem solving. I'm happy you found us, whether you're a beginner just starting out or you're already sculpting at an advanced level. I'm thrilled to help you develop your skills. The team in the studio today includes Alex, who's going to be keeping our cameras going, and Jason, who's going to be monitoring our chat for questions and helping you get your answers during this presentation. Please feel free to use the chat feature to ask any general questions you have throughout our live stream, and we'll do our best to address them. I don't know who's in the room right now, so I just want to do a quick test to see that that feature is working. And having a love of sculpture myself, I wanted to ask if you have any favorite sculptors, if you could type down one or two of your favorites in the chat so we can see who's here with us and who out there might have some other favorites for people to enjoy. So we'll just take a look and see if anybody's here with any awesome hellos and encouragement. Thank you guys so much for sharing your favorites. I can't wait to see them. Well, sculpting is an incredibly broad topic. It's really hard to pick any favorites. I have lots of favorites because it has a rich history with lots of technique, and there are many, many different sculpting materials out there to explore. For the sake of our conversation today, though, I'm only going to be making comparisons within the scope of the Chavant products. These are non-hardening, non-drying, oil-based clays, and we have a wide range of options to pick from. Seriously, we have some incredible clays, and I definitely recommend checking them out on our website as well. We have some additional tools here that you can see on our website, as well as technical bulletins with additional processing recommendations for our clays. Softening charts, we're going to take a look at some of those today when we cast the Alien Clay into a silicone mold. And there are videos to better help you understand why you might want to pick one clay over another. Just for a comparison, we have a comparison chart for you that's quick and easy reference, just with some of our sulfur-free sculpting and modeling clays side by side that you can view at this following link. I have this here so you can see some key features between some of these shaping clays. You can see right off the bat with the images, there are different color options. Some of them soften at different temperatures. They may come in different packaging, which we're going to review in a moment with the Alien Clays. It's truly unique to help you get started. So please feel free to check this out. And again, if you have any questions, you're going to be able to reach out to us as well. So there are some things I wanted to review before we get started. It can take a significant dedication of time to make a complete sculpture, whether it's a very small scale or a very large one, to bring it up to its finished detail. I'm not going to be shaping a fully sculpted and detailed masterpiece during this presentation, but if you're interested in seeing that, please check out those videos for the Alien Clay products on the Chavant website so that you can see a piece go from start to finish. There's some really exceptional techniques demonstrated there in the videos that I do recommend checking out. We even have some sculpted examples here that you see come together in those videos. Instead, what we're going to do here is go through a series of sculpting exercises together and some demonstration hands-on examples to get a better idea of how the Alien Clays work with different types of application when you're doing different contextual steps so that you can get some pro tips and see it in action in some again, some things we're going to cover some basics, and in others we're going to bring it up to some advanced processes. But whenever I work with a new clay, I put it through a series of these sculpting exercises. I'll even make a small-scale test piece or maquette before I do a larger sculpture and increase my scale. This allows me to perform some tests even with my mold-making materials and help build up experience with the clays. But beyond those exercises we were just talking about, let's dive in to explore what else we're going to do today so you can see what these alien clays do. What are we going to learn here at today's demonstration? Well, we're going to look at some tips for warming the alien clay because its properties do change in terms of how it performs at different temperatures. We're going to use some solvents to smooth it out and take that an extra step and look at how you can polish a very firm clay. We're also going to review some tips for casting the alien clay into silicone molds so that you can make castings that may be revised or variations could be made of them. There are a lot of different reasons why you might want to cast clays, and we're going to help align you for success with those processes, as well as review some common tools and materials. We're also going to take a look at the different packaging that the alien clays come in, so you can see your options when you're picking how much material you might need for your project. And why don't we start with that packaging aspect of it? Because I happen to have some packages right here with the alien clays. They do come in 3 different hardnesses. Now, overall, this series at room temperature is extremely firm. So in that comparison chart, you'll even see that there are a range of different hardnesses. When we're talking about a soft, a medium, and a hard alien clay, keep in mind that these materials to start with are already at a carvable, very firm state. So with the soft hardness, I can actually use hand pressure and go ahead to make impressions on this clay. And that's actually one of the reasons that I recommend, if you're going to be tooling the clay at room temperature, that you start with the alien clay soft. The warming tools and warming equipment we're going to review is going to make it even easier. But if you know that you're going to be carving into your clay, this is a great place to do your hand shaping. This is the softest of the series. The medium alien clay, and they come in these wonderful wedges. And we're going to talk about that in the packaging too in just a second. I'm going to open up one of these containers. What I wanted to show you is it takes a bit more hand pressure. I can still make a dent in the material. I can still cut into it and smooth it by hand, but it has more resistance. So by the time you get to the hard alien clay, it has even more dimensional stability in terms of holding its form without wanting to deform under pressure. And that is why it's so popular for detailing smaller figures, so that when you handle it, you don't undo all of that hard work that you've done on the detail of the smaller figure. Those wedges that we saw are actually the smallest size available in an individual wedge. But the next size up is going to be the alien clay saucers. And this has 2 layers of these wedges separated by a paper to keep the alien clay from sticking to itself underneath. And we're actually going to talk about that in just a second too, because before you warm the clay, we're going to want to take those out. But the nice thing about these wedges is that they're ready to go. If you are looking to start your project right away, you can open up the lid and take a wedge out and get started. So they're hand-sized, very easy to move your project forward if you're working at room temperature and not heating the clays right away. It's all ready and set there for you. But the saucers aren't just protecting your clay. They also are used to heat the clay. So this lid and this saucer can go in the warmer, in your warming oven, and we're going to look at different ways that they can be heated to withstand those temperatures so that you can heat the clay in the container. So it's just as easy to get started at room temperature as it is to heat it up if you want a softer result. The last size that the alien clay comes in are these bulk bars. And the bulk bars, you can think of them as refills for the containers, but another option is if you're working on a larger scale project. This is a larger amount of material ready to go. If you're scaling up and you don't need the container, you have your own container to provide. So we have the individual wedges, the saucers, the containers with the individual wedges inside, as well as the bulk bars as options for the alien clay. So it's an entire system. You're going to see we actually have one of these containers warming up right now. But I wanted to point out that in the container, so I'll grab the one that's warming up, it does have these wonderful handles so that you can keep that warm clay away from you so that you're reducing any of that warmth coming in contact with your hands. And you may have noticed as well that these wonderful containers also have a pour spout. So the alien clay can be brought to a liquid temperature and also poured out of these containers. The lid can be put back on. It can be resealed if you have extra clay that you're not using and reheated over and over. So they're very, very cool in terms of accessibility for using the clay as well as making the most out of your investment in the materials. So let me show you some warmed up clay, because at this point, the alien clay's properties are something you might be curious about. We've looked at how it comes, but what does it actually do, right? So one of the things that's very nice about how this clay works, and I am taking it out of a warming oven where the clay itself is at a temperature 115 degrees to soften it. So that's why I didn't use heat gloves for that, because it's very easy just to soften, and it's just slightly warm. And at this temperature, compared to what I was just showing you with the wedges, the clay itself is very, very pliable. And the moment that it comes out of the container into the cooler air, it will start to get firmer. You'll feel that little bit more resistance. So this is what we consider the softening temperature. You can see it's nice and soft, but what I wanted to show you is the elongation of the softened material, that plasticity. You can see that extends out really nicely when it's warm. It comes to a point. Let me roll out some more for you. So this is going into the properties of the alien clay itself. I want to talk with you about what makes a good sculpting clay in the first place. So that elongation gives you just a really nice, pliable clay that has just a little bit of stretch, but still holds its proportions very, very well. So usually when you describe that elongation, that's that plasticity of the clay that you see coming to a point there and extending out. But the strength is less than what you would want from, say, a casting resin or something like that, for example, because, and I know it's funny to say you want to lower strength as a sculptor. I have an example for you of why. This is a children's toy that many of us grew up with, and I just wanted to show you when you don't have that strength, when you don't have that break, what happens is the material will deform more and more and more, and you'll lose all that information you sculpted in. So we actually want a slightly lower strength so that when we are using the clay and we want to cut it or break off a small amount, it doesn't indefinitely change its shape. It actually does tear and come away, unlike a silly putty, for example. So this material, in its softened state, is very easy to do all kinds of different shaping processes with and manipulate. Hard to believe that that's the same material that you saw here, that actually, I'm gonna grab a And X-Acto carves and cuts so cleanly to get really precise and controlled lines. So sculpting, when people think of sculpting, a lot of the times they think of just adding up material on top of itself, but carving is a really essential part for subtractive sculpture, for taking material away, and knowing what temperature to work with the alien clay at can be more conducive for one step over another. At this step, with how soft it is, I may choose to rough out my form, let it return to room temperature, and then cut my detail into it, which we're going to look at tools and carving later on in the demonstration. So, regarding the clay itself, it can do a lot of different things. And we've looked at the best possible recommendations we can make, and they're on the technical bulletin for this product, which we talked about, is on the Chavant website. I also have a copy of it here, and you should see a copy of it on the screen. And you'll see that softening temperature that I was talking about listed here, as well as those differences in hardnesses between the soft, the medium, and the hard alien clay. We just looked at what that softening temperature looks like compared to room temperature performance. Same material, just different functionality. And you may have noticed when I was working with it too that no material is coming away on my hands or on my surfaces. The nice thing about this is that the alien clay sticks to armature surfaces very well, and I can give you some tips for maximizing that too, but it doesn't stick to my hands or stick to my tools. So it's very unique out of the Chavant products in that regard, that it doesn't have that adhesive hand feel.
We actually had a question about releasing the clay from plastics.
Oh.
Does it leave a lot of residue on like an SLA printed piece or a cast resin piece if you were overlaying it? And would you have like a release recommendation at all? I don't think you'd get a lot of residue.
Yeah, what a great question. So the question being about the properties of it releasing from plastic surfaces. There are many different plastics out there, but generally, so this, in terms of a plastic surface, it holds its position and it has a little bit of grab because of the pressure, but it comes away without leaving. Like I was going to say, just because of the structure, you can get some residue there, but it comes away clean. And that's really what you want to be able to get as much precision to your lines as you can. I actually was going to show you something, because this, for a beginner, can actually pose a challenge, this lack of adhesion, when you're building up on top of an armature or a surface substrate. I hope I answered your questions. In terms of releasing, I wanted to let you know, before we go too far off of that though, that when we demonstrate with the silicone, you'll see that a release agent isn't necessary, that there's some materials that are less adhesive than others. So I do actually recommend trying it on a non-critical part of your plastic surface first. I have had with 3D prints, the thing you need to be aware of the most, because it's much easier to make revisions in clay than it is in a printed plastic. I totally understand. But you want to know the temperature range that your 3D print functions under. There's a lot of different plastics out there. So if you're working with this at a warmer state and we're going to work with it at a higher temperature next, you would just want to be aware that your part wouldn't deform, because that temperature could have more of an effect on thinner section parts or thicker section parts. So I recommend doing a small test first, especially because different surface textures have more grab and grip than others, which is what I was going to show you. So when you make a maquette with an armature wire, which is a very traditional way of sculpting, a lot of people are familiar. You get this bendy wire and you build your armature up. You may just be thinking, okay, I just need my proportions and my shape. Well, if you do that, you may not have so much surface texture for the clay to grip to. So here I have just an exposed wire, right? And if I go to put that clay on there, it's just my pressure encapsulating the wire. If I put too much pressure on it, just like you saw, it could come away really easily. However, if you take another smaller wire, and wrap it around your larger one, or you make sure that you get some really good overlap. That creates more surface texture for the alien clay to stick to. So as you build it up, it'll register better into that surface and be less likely to want to come away. And I say that because the better adhesion you can have with your armature, the less likelihood that you're going to have any cracking or separation on your sculpture further down the road. So I have another example where it's not mounted to a board here. I have a robot that eventually is going to be performing some Shakespeare. He's just in his rough state now, but you can see that the armature wire is exposed, so it's not actually mounted to a base. The reason I wanted to show you this is because we were just talking about the hardnesses of the different alien clays. And depending on how thin your section is, you may still preserve that ability to shape or bend the material without it breaking. Now, I wanted to show you that I intentionally left the hands free so I could cut and modify and reconnect. Without a mechanical bond there, it's much easier for the clay just to come away. So some people actually design their sculptures to be removed in pieces for the mold making process. So when you do think about your armatures, consider all the way to your end result. How far are you taking this? Will it be just during your construction phase, or ultimately are you making a reproduction? So whether you're doing a study or this is just part of a larger project, you may want to test those separate parts on something smaller first. Like in this case, I could have just sculpted a hand or an arm as my test piece before diving into that larger piece. And that's typically called a maquette, what we were talking about before. So we were talking earlier about warming the clays, and I showed you the warmed clay, but I want to show you the process of warming it, because that may be something you might not be familiar with or have done before. I have a few different tools here, and you'll see tools recommended on the technical bulletin for these products that we talked about, different warming systems. I have a bun warmer here that you can see on the camera. I'm just moving it over a little bit more. So this isn't an oven as much as it is designed to keep, sometimes it's referred to as a food warmer. It goes up to 185 degrees Fahrenheit. And because the softening temperature is 115, that's well within range. I don't want to be handling overly hot clay. And that's why that next step in that softening temperature is actually going to be a little bit different. So actually, we'll come back and look at these in a moment. But I am behind the scenes also working with a crock pot. The thing about the crock pots is that you don't have an even heat all the way around like you do with the warmer. The warmer will warm up your clay faster because it's in an evenly in an enclosed space. This definitely has its heating element on the bottom, but I use a crock pot that has a temperature gauge, so I know how hot my material is. In this case, it's right at a brushable state. So it's starting to become a liquid, but it's a very thick, very viscous liquid. I'm going to take that thermometer out. The thing that I wanted to show you with this, though, and this time I will go ahead and use some gloves, is that I'm not actually putting the clay directly against the pot itself. I'm using a silicone insert that has an adjustable height. And the reason I'm doing this is so I can move my clay over to my area, or if I wanted to heat up a different clay, I don't have to clean out the whole crock pot to do that. So I can actually have multiple batches going, work with it, and then return it to the heat. So this will actually start to thicken even further until it hits a trowelable state. And I'll show you the difference there between that brushable and trowelable. But I want to show you this because in general, crock pots, they're not designed to be taken out hot. You don't want to handle these against your skin at those higher temperatures. They're designed to cook food. So you want to be careful and make sure that you're within a range of temperature that you can control what you're doing and be aware of those different properties of the clay, but also that you don't hurt yourself in handling it. I just find that the silicone inserts are a little easier to clean, very inexpensive, so they save me time and give me a little more flexibility between multiple batches of clay. So I'm going to move this off to the side, and I can show you exactly what I meant about that troweling and brushable temperature, because they may seem very similar, right? One of the important takeaways I want you to have of those differences is that I am using a knife. I'm in this particular case, this is a palette knife or a trowel, because I'm going to spread this and I want it to hold up on a vertical surface. So with a trowelable temperature, whether I'm using a wood stick or whether I'm using a metal tool, and I've seen all different types of spatulas as well, I'm using it to spread on a surface. I'm not coming in contact with my hands to do this. So I'm actually just going to take the stick, and you can see that thick, viscous liquid there. And I'm just going to spread some right here on the surface. And this is actually right about, so close to the bottom here, because of how the heat was distributed, this is on that borderline of whether you would be brushing it or whether you would be spreading it. And I do recommend having paper down underneath, because you may have noticed just a little bit of splatter there. As this hardens up in just a few moments, it'll get even more spreadable. So it goes from being that thick, viscous liquid to being shapeable. So if I stir this up to get down to the bottom of that liquid material, we can even take a brush to where that highest heat was against that crock pot. You can see that's a thick liquid. Not something I would pour, but something I can easily use to coat a surface. And I do this for two reasons. I have an example for you that I can show. One, it creates a little bit of tooth, so I can add a sculpted layer on top of this very easily. Two, it reduces how much loss of detail I have underneath. Now, this is a very smooth surface. At a certain point, I want to stop. I don't want to rework that as it cools. In that thin section, it's going to lose heat faster. But where I really love brushing on is when I'm working on armatures for larger sculptures that are EPS or styrofoam, for example. And the reason I like brushing on that thin layer is, one, you can see that texture, so it makes it easy to mix up a ball of softened clay and spread it on the surface. But also, if I had carved the styrofoam at all and I had exposed pieces, I don't want those pieces of foam getting into my mix. If it gets into my, my clay, I'm not going to be able to get it back out again. By putting on a thin layer first, I've basically sealed that. And in some cases, an artist might choose even to use an epoxy sealer on the styrofoam as well after they've carved it or shaped it. I find both work very well. We have lots of different products on the smooth-on side of things that you can use on top of EPS foam. And you can, I was going to say, I had that handful of softened clay, which actually we can take some out of the container we had just softened because it's still nice and soft and spreadable, right? And you can still apply this onto the foam. Here, I'll divide it in two pieces. I can still spread that and have that, press that on in my thickness and do my shaping in my initial layer. But if I had carved this and I had exposed foam, I wouldn't want those bumps to get into my clay and add unintended texture. So by putting the clay on top of the brushed layer, I have more control. You can feel that really good adhesion with the surface. So let's say I was going to sculpt up horns or something like that. I have a nice bond with that foam.
We actually had a couple of people asking about how this clay compares to Castilene. we have a couple people using Castilene and are wondering like what the main differences are.
Oh, what a wonderful question. So we have some questions about a comparison with the Castilene, and I have some examples to show you. So let me just set this aside. Now this is cooled down a little bit, and while I'm doing that, I was showing you how it thickens up pretty quickly. That's more of that trowelable temperature we were looking for. So Castilene is the hardest of the Chavant clays, and when we were looking at those comparisons, I'm so glad you asked. Thank you. I love working with Castilene. This is the product that we're talking about for comparison. So all of these castings are made from those fine art sculpting clays we were looking at with Chavant. So these are both the Castilene product. Now, when you look at these clays side by side, you may not notice a difference. So this is Alien Clay medium, and Castilene medium. Unfortunately, the video and the images are only going to be able to do so much to convey the differences, but I do have a scale here set up so I can show you the differences in the weight of the material. Because some of the clays are lower density than others. Like you just saw me applying the Alien Clay to the foam surface. Well, that's great for working on top of foam because it's a very lightweight, low density clay. Let me see where I'm looking for. There it is. It's always the last place you look. I have a gram scale right here so I can show you that difference. But for the sake of texture, the Castilene series is firmer than the Alien Clay series. The color's a little different. It's green in appearance, not this wonderful cool gray that's darker. So if you're looking for a lighter color clay, that would be the Castilene. The other examples that you see here, well, this is getting started, are the NSP series, which if you could feel it in your hands, the Castilene it feels like half of the weight of what you feel with the NSP. So actually, let's take a look. Let's see how close I am. Oh, loading. Give the numbers a second to do their thing. And then the other example here that has that same level of detail is actually this is a slightly different example. There we go. This is the Contour Clay series. And what I wanted to show you with this compared to the NSP, the reason I have these examples, these castings, are because these different clays can all be brought to a full liquid pourable temperature. In terms of what you see with the NSP, the Alien Clay, and the Castilene, the Contour Clay is the exception. This casting was made by brushing. It never gets to a pourable state, but it can be brushed into a mold to capture all that fine detail. So depending the size of your mold and what you're looking for out of them, here, so the NSP, the Castilene, the Contour Clay, and the Alien Clay all give you outstanding results. What you're seeing in this high gloss, and why I have these examples here too, is that comes from the mold itself. So I have some molds here with some different textures. The mold here that was used for this Castilene example, you can see it's flowed into even all these small, very, very tiny raised orbs. And that gloss is actually from the glossy mold. Where this example in Alien Clay was made from a matte ceramic piece. Oh, there we go. Side by side, there's no difference in that material in terms of its makeup. The only difference is that the mold itself is matte in appearance, and that's what the Alien Clay is capturing so wonderfully. So when it comes to texture, not only is it flowing very thin into those fine areas, just like the Castilene does. So both of them are outstanding for casting with liquid pores, but it's picking up that high quality of the textural information and detail that's coming out of the silicone molds. These are MoldStar 16 molds. I have a few different MoldStar molds here, as well as some textures that were made off of a brushed silicone texture stamp as well. So hopefully that answers your question. Was there anything else you'd like to know in comparison? The only other major difference I can tell you that you'll see on the technical bulletin, other than of course the hardness, is that the Castilene has a higher wax content, so it can even be used for lost wax casting for foundry. And that means that it tends to, when softened, shape and work more like a wax and less like a traditional plastilina or plasticine oil-based clay. So that is, again, the hardest clay that we offer, as well as the highest wax content. The Alien Clay products also have a very high wax content and can be used with those same tools. So at the end of the presentation, I can show you some of those warming tools that you can use to actually cut in to the material as well. And I can show you we can cut into both surfaces. But yeah, were there any other questions that came up in the meantime, or?
Another question about Castilene. That's a clay you'd recommend using heated tools for, right? As opposed to Alien Clay, which you could use room temperature tools on, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. So with Alien Clay, if you're using room temperature tools, I think the Alien Clay Soft is the best option there. Otherwise, we do recommend warming tools for the medium or the hard, or at least the warmers to be able to shape with it. With Castilene, from the soft all the way to the hard, because they're just in another tier of hardness, firmer than the Alien Clay, I would recommend warming tools for all of them.
We did have somebody ask about the comparison in weight again.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yep, thanks for asking. I was going to say, I was setting it up. Numbers are hard, and it decided to turn off on me because I got distracted, so I apologize for that. But we'll get those numbers working again. And that's actually why I had these samples, so that you could see the difference, because I can feel them and say, oh, this one is slightly smoother or more buttery. That would be the contour clay. This one is a little firmer. And I'm like, I don't know if I can show you with the Castilene, even indenting it with a fingernail is very difficult compared to, say, the NSP, which I can cut into very easily. You know what, I'll just use the X-Acto, because you can see that nice crisp line for that precision. NSP is very, very precise. It has less of that elongation so that it can cut very, very cleanly. But you can see those are very sharp, very thin lines. The Castilene, to be able to do that, you absolutely can do that. It's more of a carving process. It takes more pressure to do. And I do know from personal experience, I've been working with these materials a long time. Sometimes I actually prefer to heat the tool and then cut into it, which is what I'll show you a little bit later. Sometimes that's a little easier, depending what you're looking to do, than just working at room temperature. All right, it turned off on me again. Okay, it's in. More power. It's in, my friend. Let me just change where it is registered, and we will see. I apologize for the technical difficulties. It's one of the nice things about working traditionally is I know one of the comments I've heard over the years about clays is you never have to worry about your computer crashing, only if it actually falls under gravity, and then you can put it back together. So that's actually one of the nice things about casting. Sometimes you're just making separate elements of clay and putting them together. You don't always have to make all your parts at once, because with clay you can actually seam them and reconnect them, which really helps for those different processes with the mold making and casting of clay we're going to move into next. I'm trying to tear it up so we get that 0, 0 on the grams so you can see how much these samples weigh. Thank you guys for being patient. Sorry about that. Yeah, actually, I'm sorry, Alex. Yeah, it's plugged in. That's not the problem. It's just not pulling up the numbers.
Nikki will grab another one and bring it on up.
Oh, great. Okay, so we'll get another one working. This one is going to be done for the day. All right. We were talking about different textures, and we were also talking about casting up the materials. When you are making a casting with alien clay, I've been asked, how thick can you make it? How big can you make the part? And I wanted to actually give you some information about applying it to surfaces for your casting. And that is that you can make it as thick as you want, but with the thickness also comes more weight. So you need to consider how you're demolding the clay as well, that you don't accidentally deform it during the demolding process, and whether you need structural support behind it. So this, for example, is an alien clay life casting that has all the pores and bells and whistles from life, but it's actually been backed with, I don't know if we can angle it so you can see it there, an expanding foam. So it's extraordinarily lightweight, and it's only about a ½ inch of thickness all the way around, and then it was backed with a rigid foam, which means that in general it's very easy to carry and move, even though it's a larger scale sculpture compared to a solid alien clay casting. You can also work on top of or cast, if you want to remove your part, a flexible foam. And doing that can actually let you demold a thinner section part without risking it breaking mechanically. So that gives you some options there. And you can even use, thank you so much, you can use a scale. Thank you. Yay, Nikki to the rescue. Pardon me while I give this another shot. Hey, this one has an on and an off switch. I can do that. When you spend a lot of time with haptic information, the touch and feel of things really can be very reassuring sometimes. So we were looking at an alien clay example. Let's go ahead and so we're looking at roughly 118 grams on the alien clay compared to the Castilene, which was the request. Sorry, I have a little deviation there. The Castilene is 103. So, yep, you're seeing that wobble with me. So the Castilene is lower density, a bit lighter, but the handling characteristics are very different than the alien clay, which feels more like a traditional clay. The NSP, in comparison, which is much more dense, is 140 grams in that same example. Now, there can be some variability to the application process. I can't assure you that I used exactly the same amount. I got it as close as I could at the time. And then with the contour clay, it's 163. So, and that may have actually been the thickest of the samples, but not by much, compared to the alien clay on the larger medallion is 257. This is a nice, easy to read one. Thanks again for the rescue. and the Castilene is 233 in this example. So just two examples to be able to show you. Again, I was pouring them to roughly eyeballing the same height, but it gives you an idea. If you were to hold them, one would be heavier than the other. And that weight distribution is something as sculptors we need to be aware of on our armatures to help make sure that our sculptures don't collapse under gravity. So again, thanks guys for your patience. Sorry about that. Why don't we pour some into a mold? Let's do that. And something I was showing you with these textures before I take it away is that you can even pick up a wood grain. This example here, which is what we're going to pour, actually even has that fine, very fine wood detail. So yeah, the alien clay can handle it. I have some other texture examples that we're gonna use with our solvents in a moment too, but first, let's pour. Did we have any other questions come up in the meantime, or did that answer everything everyone wanted to know? Great. All right, so we do have some recommendations for preheating your mold. And that's because I can show you some of the things that can go awry if you don't preheat. We recommend 150 degrees Fahrenheit for the preheating of the silicone mold. You want to make sure that your silicone, generally silicone can withstand that temperature, but double check your material to make sure you're using a silicone mold, because that can handle the higher temperatures as well as the be less adhesive overall to the clay. And I'm going to introduce you to my last warming device. And it looks like a crock pot, but it's not. Now, I can warm it directly in the container and pour out of that pour spout. We were a little limited in space, and I wanted to show you how this works so you can have another option depending on the size of your project. Now, when I pour a liquid clay, I want to make sure it's thoroughly premixed first so that all those components are evenly distributed. And I have it up to that pouring temperature, which is the liquefy temperature, which for the alien clay is 212 Fahrenheit. So this is a chocolate warmer. Sometimes they're called like a tempering, chocolate tempering. So it's designed to get warmer for chocolates, for example. So this is a preheated mold, and this is a heated liquid alien clay. And you can see that pour in that nice thin stream, which helps you maximize detail and reduce bubbles. And it looks like I missed just a little bit of that mix. Could have been a little more thorough there. And you don't want those large chunks, because that can do what's called choking in the mold and prevent material from flowing through. I have an example of that. But you can see those bubbles rising to the surface. And I'm just going to pour up to that top so it's even with the top of the mold. So very simple, straightforward. I can let this cool down. We can even shape with it. So I might just set that right off the side for the moment. And I can always put it back in my container and close my lid and heat it up all over again. The important part is that you make sure that it's fully constituted, fully liquid before you pour. That choking that I was talking about that can occur into a mold, you don't have to just cast into silicone. There are other different mold materials that alien clay can be used with, including an alginate. So with the Smooth-On AlgiSafe alginate, I have some life castings here that were done with the alien clay. But you may notice this, I needed an extra set of hands, and unfortunately this one did not turn out because of that same reason that you saw before. If you think of the mold like this, the large section of alien clay blocked it and prevented it from flowing through, and that's referred to as when the clay chokes up in the mold and can't pass through. Another thing I wanted to show you is you might have noticed that when I poured evenly, and I didn't just stop and start. And the reason I didn't is because if you pour into a mold and you pour a little bit and then you wait and then you pour a little bit and you let it wait, the bubbles rising up can cool against the surface of a cold mold. That's why we heat the mold so that you get the most detail out of your mold possible. And actually, I have a mold ready to demold of that example I just showed you. So let's go ahead and demold one. And you can see all that beautiful detail that's supposed to be there just by preheating your mold, as opposed to pouring into that cold one too slow. So that's a significant difference there. What is nice, though, is that other example, normally, if that was a casting that I made out of resin, I'd have to throw it away, or I'd have to work very hard to restore it or sand it. With the clay, it's much easier to process and correct mistakes, and that can even add to part of the variation that you do when you're doing a series of different options. So if anybody has any other questions about, all right, pouring or casting clay, I'm going to move this out of the way because I want to show you a large-scale casting so you can see what I mean about that reinforcement behind the clay that I was telling you about. And we can just move that off to the side for the moment. Because I have a nice large alien clay medium casting of a cosplay chess piece. This is pretty big, right? So how do you pour into a mold like that and preserve as much detail as you can? In this particular case, the alien clay was brushed into the surface of the mold, bringing it to a brushable temperature, doing 2 to 3 layers that way to make sure that there was full coverage. And then after that, you can make it as thick as you want. So this is troweled and spread. It could even be softened and you can build it up. So you can see this is about a ½ inch of thickness. Now, if I was worried about the weight of it, which you notice that had a little bit of heft, I'm sorry, I'm not weighing this one, you just have to take my word for it. Sometimes the weight of the piece, that lack of strength that makes it a good sculpting material, may not hold it together on that larger scale. And that's where I was saying that you can use a few different options, including an epoxy putty that's very lightweight to reinforce the back, or the foam we talked about. You could see how that rigid foam could help build up that support depending what you're doing with the piece. The nice thing with the higher temperature range that it takes to liquefy the alien clay is that it can withstand that exotherm of applying thin sections of these materials to be able to reinforce it and strengthen it if you're going to continue to sculpt on it. So when I was asked how thick does it need to be, and I said, well, it has to hold its own weight without breaking, and it needs to be the thickness of whatever you're going to cut into. So if I was going to cut detail into this, I would want to make sure there was clay in that area so that I don't cut into my reinforcement material. But this allows you to create large clay pieces. You can see even from this example, you could create large sections and then combine them to do something that's even monumental, that's much lighter weight than if you were going to use some of the other options that we were just looking at. While I have this out, why don't we look at some of those solvents and smooth it? So one of the neat things that I have here, I have a lot of neat things here today. Well, you know what? Let me show you this, and then we'll get to the smoothing. That chess piece can wait just a moment so that this can come into the camera. So I can show you some of these other textures, some more extreme textures than some of the ones that you saw just a moment ago on those small castings. So this material that you see up here is a silicone texture stamp. It's actually the Rebound 25. So as opposed to the pourable silicone, it's the brush-on one. And these are just some different ranges of textures that you can get. Like we saw the surface quality, whether it was glossy or matte, it can pick up this outstanding detail even in this case. So the one that you're seeing on the camera here, we have 2 different tree barks of different thicknesses, And then you have a snakeskin. So let me grab that thin snakeskin piece. So you can actually see with the texture here exactly how that came out. So if this, in this particular case, I let them set up against the silicone, but I could just as easily warm the clay and press the silicone into the alien clay and stamp it, or even create small pieces of interest and add them. So I could do both processes back and forth. But this example here looks a little different, right? So there's two things going on here. On one side, we have the texture directly from the stamp itself, which you can see is sharp, but rather muddied from the different distance because of how subtle it is. What you see here has a slip applied to it, which has settled into the grooves to even out the texture a little bit and unified those high points, so you get the most out of that dimensionality. So with those solvents that we're going to use, there are a few on that technical bulletin. I have some here, including the naphtha solvent, and I can show you how that works for smoothing that chest piece we were just talking about. Now, when we looked at that stormtrooper before, now you can see that this casting, how it came out on this one side, that was how this side looked as well. And you can push that smoothing to, with the solvents to extremes and lose detail and resculpt that detail in, because that surface is still very nice and firm and workable once the solvent evaporates out. So this is entirely possible to sculpt and resculpt, even though it had that blemish out of the mold initially. And here, so you can see them side by side. You can see the difference, right? So the smoothing not only filled in the gaps, but it also reduced the crispness and the gloss of that surface, where there may be times where you want that. It really comes down to being aware of what your options are in controlling the appearance of the material. But I do have some tips for applying solvents to alien clay that I want to show you. So let's just experiment with this chest piece. All right, two big things. Smoothing is kind of like when you're using sandy pads, that you use different grits and you can work progressively up to a very, very smooth surface by changing the grits. In this case, the grit is going to be our brush. So using a smoother brush is going to reduce the texture of the brush strokes itself when I work with the solvent. So if I were to use a brush like this, I'm going to lose more crisp detail. I'm going to have a significant effect more on that surface, because it's like using a much coarser grit and a finer grit in this case. So the solvent, the naphtha that I'm using on the surface, and we can do it. I can show you how that would compare. We can just take some and smooth over these planes so that the solvent softens the material and fills in, making the surface more uniform and smoothing. So with this chest piece, I did have some areas that I patched, where I took a small amount of clay and I filled in a gap. And by smoothing on top of it, it helps conceal that. And I can change the direction as well that I go. And if I allowed the clay in the material to settle out, it is going to create a liquid slip that can actually be coated right on top of the material. And that looks like this. So I have a naphtha slip right here where it's dissolved into the liquid. So it almost looks like that liquid clay. But you can bring that, so we can actually pour a little bit more in there. Oh, ahead and brush that away. So we have a nice thin slip, and this is commonly used for makeup effects applications, for example, to fill in pores or blend and feather sharp edges. So I have just a rough face right here. I'm going to show you a little bit with that smoothing with the solvent, how that unifies the surface and generates just a little bit of extra clay. On this side. And if I didn't want it to be as intense as this, I could do a 50-50 mix with isopropyl alcohol to reduce the intensity. Sometimes you still want you want to build it up in layers and preserve as much sculpted information there as possible. Other times, so I'm going to grab some of this slip now, and I'm going to coat over and fill in the gaps so that it looks more uniform and settles out, and add volume on the surface. So I realize this is a very subtle thing, but you can see how either solution could help you dial in the effect you were looking for. One is adding material to the surface in a very thin liquid form. The solvent will evaporate out and just leave the clay. The other one is softening the surface a little bit and letting you use your brush to remove it. And a big part of that is going to be the pressure and the approach and the brushes you use. You may choose to use progressively softer brushes, or if you were going to use a really rough one, like I promised we would do. So we'll go backwards here and we'll take some and try and roughen that up. That could help contribute to your pore texture. Now I'm really overdoing it, but you can see that on the screen that it's actually creating some texture as that solvent is evaporating off, right? Or if I wanted to brush that away more dramatically, you can see the lines from the brush itself. But here, let's stay with that stippling so we have a more uniform look over the thumbprints on the piece itself, right? So you would let that dry without handling it and then take your next step. So you might do this in several different passes to get different effects for different reasons. I was going to say, I have an example that was on the table before. Where that slip was used very, very, very dramatically. So you can see again how the one has been softened and become more matte and textured, where the other one is kept to a high gloss. So if you wanted to work gradually towards this as opposed to just jumping to this step, you could use softer brushes and you could use a less intense solvent. So hopefully that makes some sense there for you. And I'm actually going to take this example here another step, and let's do some polishing on it. So the polishing is a little different than using a solvent to smooth. I should say, if you haven't smoothed the clay before, the Alien Clay Soft is going to be the easiest to smooth just with hand pressure, right? There are different ways to create a smooth effect on that surface. So before we jump right to the polishing, sometimes just the spread of hand pressure can give you you're sort of functionally scraping it with the lines on your own hands, but that can also allow you to do the smoothing process. So I'm just going to take a small amount of the softened Alien Clay, very, very small amount, so pliable and soft, and I'm going to look for an area where I can just put that in and spread it. So that is how I was plugging imperfections just by hand and then going over it with the solvent to make that seamless. And then I can take that to the next step and polish it, which we could do next.
We actually had a question about whether the solvents are going to affect the reusability of this clay.
That is a great question. So the question is, will the solvents affect the reusability? So with the solvent, it doesn't leave the surface softer. The solvent evaporates out, which is why we have some specific recommendations on the technical bulletin for alien clay, that there are some citrus-based solvents out there that can leave a residue on the surface that actually can affect the mold making process. So you always want to do a small test if you're going to be making that mold as well, or even just to see how it performs. Like I was just saying, so I have that 50-50 mix that is less intense. Looking at it, I may decide this might be the way that I want to go. I may want to take gradual steps as opposed to dramatic steps. There is a phenomenal example of this process on video on our website, performed by and demonstrated by the artist Milo here, who did this tremendous piece and also showed in detail how he used a solvent to more gradually control the textures on this piece. The reason I'm showing this to you now, other than he did an absolutely amazing job, and I love relief sculpture, I'm a big fan, is that he also was able to make a mold directly off it without any change to the surface quality. So when you add a release agent, or if you paint a surface, you can change that textural information, like introduce brush strokes, or different textures from the release agent or a sealing agent. With the alien clay, it's silicone friendly. You can pour the silicone directly against it. And that can let you play too with different textures with like acrylic paints, for example. I don't have an example to show you, but I can tell you from personal experience, I've done water effects this way by painting the clay with a thick bristle brush, so it looked like waves movement in my brush strokes, so that when I made the casting, it then looked like there was movement, and I used the paint to do that. If you're trying not to have brush strokes on your surface, so the alien clays are paintable. You can paint them with acrylic clay, paint directly on the clay. But the nice thing about doing that is different paints have different gloss levels, and that can allow you some control too over that surface quality that shows up in your casting then, if you're making a translucent casting or an opaque casting. I previously did a YouTube live presentation on that very thing that please feel free to check out and let me know if you have any questions. But I don't have a painted example for you today, but essentially when you apply a sealing agent to the clay, if you're using an acrylic, and you'd want to use a spray if you don't want brush strokes, because then you can get more even coverage. But the brush strokes aren't always a bad thing. It depends what you're using it for. So let's do that polishing process so you can see how that differs from the solvents. Because with the polishing process, you're actually removing the polisher off the surface as well. So I have two recommendations for you for different options to polish the clay. And this is only an option with a clay this firm, because typically, if you have a very soft clay, you can just use your tools and scrape it or use hand pressure to smooth your surface. When the clays are this firm, you can actually take that one step further. I have an alien clay example here that I did want to show you. You can actually take a sanding pad and smooth out that surface mechanically if you want to, without even needing to change the temperature of that clay. It's just that the buildup of the clay can build up on your pad and make it gummy, but it's definitely an option to do that without any additional liquid. Again, it depends what you're looking for. I can just as easily get a texture by pressing into the clay surface to get a pour texture off of the sanding pad without having to heat it or anything like that. I'm going to do this a few times so you can see a little bit more of it built up in this area, that it's not as smooth as the areas where I've hand smoothed the clay. So I can basically use this to scrape the clay until it builds up too much on that surface. I can use a sanding pad to press texture in just with pressure. And that's where, this is at room temperature, this is the Alien Clay Soft that's allowing me to do this so nicely. Or I can just work with it with my hands because it's the softest of the Alien Clay products. But when you have a firmer option and you're trying to really, really smooth out these planes, these polishing liquids can be used to actually bring a smooth surface all the way up to be almost flawless in terms of evening that out. So there are two options, and I am going to use two different paper towels for this to show you, similar to what we were doing with the paintbrushes. This towel has a texture on it, and that texture is going to translate to lines, just like having a very rough brush. Yep, there we go. You can see the texture on your screen. This is very soft and smooth. I recommend this for polishing. You could jump right to this step. If you have an area that is a little higher in texture and you just want some help on that pressure aspect of it, you can use the rougher towel, but just make sure that it doesn't have, we recommend like a high quality shop towel because that, so I'm using Dermatec remover here on the towel, which is, it's a skin safe material. And I can either move in one direction or I can buff it just like I would use a polishing pad to even out that surface so that that plane is as smooth as possible. And you'll see a little bit of material is coming off on that texture. That's why I wanted to show you the textured one first. But that texture is also putting lines in. When on this example, the textured towel is used right on this side. You can see some scratches there, where on this side, it's the smooth towel. So I just started it with the one, and I'm just wiping off the extra. And this time I'm going to use the recommended towel, which is nice and smooth. So both work, the Avon Skin So Soft and the Dermatec. It depends, you know, what part of the world you are in terms of finding your closest distributor for accessibility, and that's why I was letting you know about both. But this can take that smooth surface and allow me to really bring that up to a polish. And you know what, I'm gonna actually pour a little bit more here, and I'm gonna start working on this area so you can see what I mean about the buffing it in small circles. It kind of takes the softened clay and fills in any really, really small imperfections. I tend to do this when I have an area that's either curved or a flat plane like this, so that I can make it very, very uniform, almost, you know, reminiscent of like an industrial Class A surface where you're really, really reducing the low points and the high points to get as even of surface as possible. But I may go in then, after this has had a chance just to dry, and add a new crisp line and smooth that out so that I can redefine where my edges are. So anyway, I'm looking for anywhere it's still glossy, and then I'm just gonna wipe away that extra material. I'm not leaving the polishing liquid on the surface. I'm not allowing it to pool. I'm just wiping it away with a clean towel so that I can reveal that flat surface underneath. So hopefully you could see that on the screen there, but yeah. So that's how the polishing liquids work. I can do the same. But keep in mind, this is only for very firm clay. So for the Alien Clay, I can recommend it. But if you have a softer clay, like, so even with the Alien Clay Soft, you might find that hand pressure or a scraper may be what you need with the solvent. So you can try some different combinations for effects. This is what I use to go across the finish line and get it as crisp as I can. And it does take a little bit of elbow grease, a little bit of handwork there to make it effective, but it will reduce down those raised areas and give you a nice uniform surface. And if you want that to be more dramatic, you can play with the different towel textures, but I do recommend finishing it with that very soft towel that doesn't give off any, a high quality shop towel that doesn't have any burrs or paper that you work into the clay. Because if you have a low quality paper towel and you work those fibers in, the only way to get those out would be to remove and carve away the surface, and that would have defeated all the work you just put into it. So that's it for polishing. Do we have any questions again about that? Okay. Well, thank you guys for sticking around. I'm really grateful you joined us today and checking everything out. At this point, we may actually be moving on to some shaping exercises to see how these materials are working. And the softness, so I'm just going to take one big alien clay wedge and make it nice and mushy. I can even repeat that again so you can see. Sometimes in a greater mass you have more heat in there. So it might be cool on the edges, but then when you go to the heart of it, it's still soft. I wanted to show you this because if you do make a larger or deeper casting, you can't tell just by touching the outside if it's ready to demold. Give it significantly more time than you think, because it may still have heat in that greatest thickness of that clay, and you don't want to pull out a casting and have it buckle or bow and bend after all that time that you've spent making it. So, but this is what I would consider a perfect texture for shaping. So we've got a handful here, we've got more if we need it, and we can move over to this other table where I have a makeshift sculpting desk ready to go. We will move the alien Gothic out of the way to make some room for us. And you may be familiar with some of these tools. I have a toolbox ready to go too. Yeah. There are times where I use the temperatures of the alien clays for different processes. So because this is nice and pliable, not liquid, not too hard, it's the perfect temperature for me to roll it. Sometimes I can flatten it just between my hands like that. And I'm just running it through a pasta roller. It's a little soft, but I can let that set up. So I have a smaller scale shoe exercise set up, and I know it's a little funny doing something that's non-figural, but sometimes when you're working with something abstract, just practicing with the clays is where you learn the most about what they can and can't do. So this is still very, very soft. I wouldn't want to use this yet. Not for laying in a thickness. I would want to give it a little bit of time to set up, but I could use it to press a texture against if I wanted to. So I've got a texture set up and I can actually roll that on the surface, and it gives me a really nice fabric texture. I don't know if that's coming across on screen. If it's not, I have another example, but yeah, you can see compared to like one that's really shiny. Can you see, is it too fine? Yeah. All right, well, I have a more dramatic one then. I'll show you that. But this means that you can pre-prepare your different textures before you apply it. And this one is going to look all kinds of different because the fabric was pressed right on top of it while it was still a liquid. You know what? Since we can't see this, this is already starting to cool because it cools the fastest in the thin section, just like we were talking about. I'll show you what I mean about the texture, and maybe you'll be able to see it this way. We happen to have some alien clay over here on our crock pot that we were talking about. And because it's in its liquid state, to bring it over here, I'm going to go ahead and use these gloves. Safety first, whenever you're working with the hot materials. You always want to protect and look out for your hands. I'm just making that a little bit more uniform. Essentially, bringing it kind of to that brushable state again. That's why I'm using 3 different heaters at this time, so I can show you all these phases without us having to wait. I'm just going to pour some right on a silicone mat. So this isn't a mold, it's just a piece of silicone. And I do actually recommend, if you ever have extra clay, to be able to pour it have it heat up faster. You can always keep a dump mold on hand, just a small silicone mold with extra that you can pour your excess into so that you can heat it up faster without needing to cut it down or wait for the full container to heat up. I'm just going to use this trowel to spread it thin. This is different than the rolling we just did, right? So you could bring it to that full liquefying temperature and pour it and give yourself a flat panel if you wanted to sculpt on top of it as a relief. This is a little less uniform, although it'll have a nice gloss on the other side of it. But I wanted to show you how you can work with different textures. All right. There we go. So depending how you press it, like whether you had a sponge or in my case, because it drops that temperature so fast once it's thin, sometimes I'll pat it down like I did, or I'll just use a brush. And this will be a less uniform texture, but it'll be more organic, so I can cut a thin section of this while it still bends and wrap it around a shape or structure. The trick with this one is because this texture is very, very porous. I don't want to press so hard that it passes all the way through, unless I want the fabric itself to add strength. It just needs a little bit more pressure. So I'm looking for that so that I see that darker gray. May have been a little too gentle the first time around. There we go. There we go. And so there's the texture in sections that I don't know if it'll come across on camera a little bit better, but you can see it goes over the undulations. So a lot of what we have to sculpt as artists can be drapery with different fabrics. Sometimes people will embed the fabrics and paint over it. This allows you an option to keep it clay all the way through so that you can still cut into it and shape it very clean and precise. Now, because it's still soft, I haven't let it set up, I'm going to have more deformation. The harder it is, the more brittle it's going to be. So how can you get the benefit of using a very firm material that would be more brittle, like the Alien Clay Hard, compare in a thin section? So this is just a thin section of the Alien Clay Hard on a silicone pad like this. It's been textured like I showed you. It's very brittle because it's the hardest, which means it's more likely to snap. But if you're cutting it when it is this hard, you can get a very crisp, clean break. So this can really help you do mechanical shapes as well. But if you find that that's not what you want, that you want to be able to soften it and bend it, you can actually use a reinforcement fabric and encapsulate it. And by encapsulating it, then instead of breaking off, that fabric adds strength. So I could use this to make a wing, for example, or a thin section. And instead of having it just tear off, you can see that that fabric is actually doing some of the work for me to keep that together, as opposed to just the clay breaking away. So another neat technique that you can see. And again, you know, if I wanted to, depending what my outcome was, if it's this sticky, it's not gonna do what I want. It's waiting for the process, that temperature that is most conducive with your tools. So. But you know for a fact now that this material is not an adhesive material. It'll come right off the more that it cools. This is right where I want it to be, though, to show you an extruding process. And this here on the silicone is not adhesive like we were talking about with the mold, so I can ball this up and sculpt with this too. Let's talk about saving money, because that can make a really big difference as to how much material you're using for a project. This shoe that you see right here has an aluminum foil core. That meant that I could actually take an inexpensive material to fill up the mass on my sculpture. And not only reduce the weight, but allowing me to help visualize faster. So even though I can brush a thin section to get precision underneath, I may not want to do that. I may just want a coating. Maybe that's just one of the secrets in sculpture I've learned over the years, is that a lot of times when people look at a piece, they only see the outside. They're not seeing what goes into the foundation underneath it. But because of how soft this is, now that stickiness is an advantage in terms of it being tacky and really bonding onto that surface mechanically. I may choose to get this to a rough. This would be a rough state, right, where I'm just fleshing out my proportions. So this could be a body of a creature. I think Chuck Jones out of Looney Tunes used to call them bean bodies whenever he made a cartoon character. If I just leave that on the pad to set up, in a few minutes I'll be able to build on top of it, and I don't have to worry about the soft clay slumping. Because the armature inside, the aluminum foil, not only is it saving me material and reducing the weight, but it's helping provide structural support so that I can keep moving, as opposed to, it's so funny, I was just going to ask if you want to build a snowman. But you can do any number of things. I would just say whatever your initial coat is on an armature, whether it's foam or aluminum, let that set up first. Then you have a hard surface to either cut into or build on top of. And now that you've seen this, you could do other structures too to fool the eye and make something seem like it has a lot more weight to it than it does. Put that on the toolbox over there, and it can wait because I promised I was going to show you how to extrude clay. And I have an extruder set up right now with some room temperature clay in it. When it cools, though, Remember how I said it becomes more brittle? That means it's going to tear a little more. So your best time to work with extruded alien clay is immediately after you extrude it, because the friction causes it to soften just a little bit. And what we'll do is we'll finish extruding this so it's just a little soft, so you have some time where it's still very pliable without breaking or snapping. And you're probably like, well, why does that matter? Depending what you're looking to do, like there are all types of sculpture, from miniature sculpture to massive designs. You may be a jewelry artist, or for some reason require a braided piece for your armor or articulation. I don't have quite as much tension on this as I would like sometimes. I don't know how much you can see on the screen. Let me try it that way. But while it's flexible, you can actually put tension on the strands. And if you extrude it on a flat side, this could be a leather belt, for example. Sorry, I'm trying to make sure the camera can see it, but I can't. But anyway, with this softer clay, you're going to have more deformation. But sometimes, think of it this way, you could let that set up, and you could go in with that slip, and you could fill it in, and let that solvent evaporate off, and you have a nice belt ready to go. And if you wanted to, you could even flatten it with a little bit of pressure or with a panel on top. But anyway, I've seen extrusions used for everything from hair as a baseline to create hair shapes, to being used for structural accessories or costuming on miniatures and small pieces. So while that clay is still soft and pliable, we're just going to extrude the rest of this out so we can empty it out and put in new soft clay so I can show you how it compares. The other thing is, when you have the warmer soft alien clay in there, if you extend and pull, it will actually reduce the thickness of a cord too, which is a little more noticeable when you have big ones than when you have small ones. But you can see how this right here, while it's soft, could be pressed together and used as a hair mass. But if you wait till it completely cools, then it'll be really brittle. Can we get some shaping in there? And then because of the precision, you can trim it without it elongates. And then you can go in and melt that down if you want and get a very, very organic appearance and movement to it. Anyway, can't believe I'm putting a wig on an alien, but there you go. You've seen how to roll out the thin sections, and you've seen how the extrusion works. I just want you to know that I personally like doing it when it's softer, in that softened state, because compared to the stress and pressure that you saw on this, which it does work. If you want longer cords, this is the way to go, even though it takes a little bit more muscle. I'm showing you this so I can show you the easy way next. But I'm definitely getting my workout today. Do we have any other questions in the chat? Is everybody still checking things out, or is it quiet over there? All right. Well, people might be thinking about their projects, and you can always give us a call here at our technical support. We have outstanding technicians here. You can, on our website, even put in an email or a technical ticket, and we can talk with you about your project needs specifically. We just have a really extraordinary team here at Chavant. So thank you to everybody who's helping out today. All right. It's funny because you can see how hand strain is a consideration when you're working with clay, mainly because the less resistance you have, the easier it is to work large, and also the more work you can do before you're tuckered out. So the more sculpting you can get in, and that's another reason why I was saying if you're just starting out, I recommend giving the soft a try. But if you're a carver and you really love cutting the materials, the hard is just really phenomenal for that.
So we actually did have a question about NSP soft
Okay.
compared to this. Is NSP in general softer than the alien clay?
Oh, I am so glad you asked about NSP because I have a surprise for you. I happen to have the NSP soft right here that you can see. So if you like working with the NSP, yes, the NSP soft is much softer than the alien clay series, right? You can see how absolutely, it's actually very similar to the consistency of the softened alien clay, although this is a little softer right now just because of the temperature that it's at. But the nice surprise that I have for you is that for some artists, especially advanced artists who have experience with the NSP, you may prefer the feel of a more traditional clay. And there are benefits to both products. You remember earlier how we said that they can be melted down to a liquid state? Well, we found that not only can you melt them down to a liquid state, but you can also combine them. So I have a special mix ratio for you to try out if you really like the NSP and you're trying to get the most out of your alien clay. We have found here that by combining 2 parts of alien clay to 1 part of NSP soft, so I recommend the soft specifically because it makes such a nice combination. I would recommend starting with the alien clay soft, but if you want to try the medium to have more resistance, you can do that too. The 2 parts of alien clay to 1 part NSP can be combined in their liquid state, mixed very thoroughly, and give you a really beautiful, smooth textural consistency for you to dial into your preference. From personal experience, I can tell you that what I really like about this option for the best of both worlds is that because the NSP is a little more dense, a little heavier, it also puts up a little bit more resistance than you can see with the alien clay there. So it's structurally very sound, even in like a really small area in terms of hand pressure. It just has a little bit more resistance for those smaller detailed areas. It does lighten the appearance slightly of the alien clay. So if you're looking for a slightly lighter clay, it can do that. But it makes the alien clay stickier. So you get more adhesion to surfaces if that's something that you're struggling with. Again, I wouldn't recommend diving into this. This is an advanced recommendation. If you find that you are an NSP user and you're looking to get some attributes a little more similar with all the benefits of the alien clay, because the NSP is very tacky, it's very sticky. When it gets softer and warmer, it becomes even stickier. So this is a nice way to offset that. And it also has a much lighter feel. So if you're working larger and looking to get that coverage where the NSP would have a bit more weight pulling on your surface, this mix ratio could be a solution for you to try too. Just please make sure that you mix it thoroughly if you give it a shot. I'd love to know what you think of it. Right now it's become one of my favorite options for working with the best of both worlds. So thanks for asking about it. So you got some comparison a little bit more as a surprise from us. That's a new featured option. So thank you for your interest in the materials. We're always looking at ways to improve our customer successes with them. And remember how we were talking about that precision with the alien clay? The thing I didn't get to show you, and we were saying that the NSP is very precise too. So with the, we might be able to roll that out so I can show you. The reason I rolled this out now that it's a little firmer, right? It's holding its form much better, is that I can take it, and that's why I have the cutting map set out so that I can actually cut to my proportions. And lay it up and have it adhere. So now you know you can leave those edges crisp, or you can go in with a solvent if you want. I was going to tell you about some of my favorite tools, and one of my very favorite tools is lighting. So I use different colors of light so I can see different surface properties. And I'll also use magnifiers, depending how fine I'm looking at, to be able to see the textured surface. This is as good a time as any to show you a little more of those tools. So you may be familiar with, scrapers, and sometimes they're referred to as dental tools, that because they're metal, there's many different names for many different types of tools, but because they're metal, you can actually use a denatured alcohol torch to warm the tool. You're never applying. So this is not on, I'm just walking through it. I'm not actually gonna use a flame right now. But if you do this, you can see very quickly that it would be easy to warm the tool and possibly, get your fingers very hot, which, as we said, we're looking at all the best safety practices, right? So I was gonna show you out of my toolbox while we're taking a tour of different tools that you can use an athletic tape. Now again, you always need to keep this away. You're not putting this in the direct flame, you're just warming the tool. I'll show you one that's wrapped, but I'm like, I could just use scissors, that would probably make sense, right? In my handy dandy toolbox with my handy dandy notebook and my calipers and all kinds of other wonderful, helpful things, you can go ahead and wrap your tools so that when you're holding them, you have a more comfortable grip for long-term sculpting sessions, and also it gives you a little bit of resistance from the area that you're warming. You just need to be absolutely, again, remember, you're just warming the tool, you're not putting it into the flame. But that's what these do. They allow you to warm a tool and then apply it to your surface. This is actually a sculptor's torch that can direct a very thin stream of heat at a surface. Again, you're never applying the flame directly. So this is a very, very advanced process, not something you want to start out as a beginner. The warming equipment we were talking about is definitely the easiest way to get a soft, viable material. But when you're moving into these advanced processes, you do have the option. Some people, some artists will use a hot knife, for example, to cut the tool, or maybe even to like a heat gun, for example, just to lightly warm a tool so that it can cut into the clay-like butter. But the better tool is one that you might not have seen before. Those of you who work with Castilene, I'm sure you're very familiar with it and probably have more experience than I do with it. But this is called a wax pen. So the alternative to working with a direct flame, which again, I don't recommend that for somebody who's just starting out, is to use a wax pen, also called a waxer, where you can control the temperature. And I'm going to do some cuts here so you can see. Because the pen itself is warm, it can allow you to smooth by heating the clay or even carve it away very easily. There's a lot of different tips and things like that. I'm only showing it because with this high wax-based unique alien clay series, being able to use these very, very precise warming tools, they become a real attribute for smaller scale detail work. As I was saying, anything from jewelry applications to models and toys and miniatures, where you can use it similar to that hot knife where you're cutting away more material, or with a round edge like this, I can go in and get a controlled line as opposed to that thin line. So hopefully you can see that there on camera. So what happens is usually if you're trying to do something like this with a standard tool is that you may get buildup from the clay not wanting to get out of the way. What you're really doing is you're pushing it. You're not necessarily warming it and smoothing it as you go, and that's why that has a rough edge. So again, some very advanced options that are out there that are commonly used with alien clay and these types of materials. But if you have the option to try it out at room temperature first, do that. Save yourself the time and stress. And if you are looking to go this direction, just keep in mind your tools can be a significant investment. These are all personal tips. Like, some of them aren't even tools, some of them are just helpful, is that if you have two pieces that aren't connecting to each other, even though you really, really want them to, there's no mechanical connection point here, although the material is very adhesive to itself, very cohesive. It wants to come away. You can actually use a structural pin, press it in so that there is a joint, something to connect it to, as opposed to just relying on the adhesion. So with this alien sculpture, there are parts of this that are designed to be cut away, where the pins are used to connect it so that certain pieces of it can separate and come away, so that I can later put it through the mold making process instead of having just one complete armature. So some of the tips and tricks I have are just actually keeping some odds and ends on hand, keeping in mind that sometimes it's a little easier to warm these materials, or like you saw, and this will be my last thing, and we'll finish up for today. I have a few aliens here on the table that I spent some time with, making impressions and looking for how different tools affect surfaces. So, I mean, for example, the marks that were made here on the forehead were actually made, I don't know if you can see it there, with a big ballpoint pen that had been taken apart and pressed in, although sometimes brass tube is very commonly used if you wanted to heat it up and then press it into the surface, as opposed to just relying on pressure alone. Let me see if I have one here. So that's where sometimes looking at things in a new way as to how these textures can interact with the surface, sometimes pressure is enough. And personally, I would always recommend that over having, until you build up those experiences with those effects that you want. But you can see the alien clay can do it. It really depends. I would say it comes down to scale, how big you're working, and what textures you might want to get out of it. So thank you very much for sticking around. And if you do have questions, please reach out to us. I wanted to let you know about what we have up and coming, because we do have many different types of presentations here with both Chavant and Smooth-On. The next one that's going to be coming up is actually going to be hosted by Heather Hanna. Please check it out. She's going to be featuring cast metal examples, and that will be September 28th, I believe, at 12:30. So I can't wait to see what happens next there. But also, please subscribe. We have email lists that let you know when we have something new up and coming. And thank you again for joining us for today's event. Good luck with your sculpting.